You have? Okay. Why do you bother come to a prison? What's wrong with you? Anyway, let me tell you about this prison, folks. Port Arthur is a prison for recidivists and secondary offenders, meaning they are professional criminals. So when I talk about them, we don't feel sorry for them. They made their choices. They did not have to be here. Just like any professional criminals today, jail is just an occupational hazard. Okay, these are bad men here and bad boys. So they are convicts who came out to Australia from England with one crime. They committed other crimes, so they ended up in here, and that's what happened. They were called colonial convicts. If you came out from England as a convict to Australia, you were known as an imperial convict. If you committed crime here in this country, you became a colonial convict, therefore a professional criminal. Therefore you would come here, or Norfolk Island, depending. So that was the way it worked out. Now the men who came here were spending many, many years here. It opened in 1830, and 30 men arrived here to exploit one particular resource, and that was timber. And they set up a sawmill approximately where this hedge is over here. And when they first arrived here, there were people here, of course, and they were called the Paitarami people. They're the first Australians, the local indigenous folk, and we acknowledge that this is their land. And basically they had a very hard life under the English. The English were not very good with First Nations peoples, unfortunately, but that was the way they were, and that was similar here. But we acknowledge that anyway, that these folk were here first. Everybody else, we're just boat people, a lot of us, that's all we are. So the first men arrived here to set up a sawmill, and the original beachfront was right here where the picket fence is. This is where the original beach was. And all this ground over here was reclaimed by the convicts to build the industrial centre, and the men were working in the industries here. Now what sort of industries? Bread making, shoe making, barrel making, furniture making. They had a tannery, they had a fertiliser works. They were making a whole range of products. They were building ships, they were doing all sorts of things for the purpose of selling on the markets of Europe and Australia. They were the workforce. And the men came here to work, and work they did very hard. 364 days of the year, one day off. Christmas Day. They worked 12-hour shifts, so their life was very harsh.
Jeez.
There was no creature comforts, no phones, no TV, just tobacco and snuff, salt, sugar and tea if you behaved yourself. All men wore shackles. Now, if you've been up to the visitor centre, have a look at the shackles in the cupboard, in this glass cabinet. That's what they look like. Two big iron rings around each ankle with a short chain in between, so all you can do is this. Now, depending on the severity of your sentence, depended on the weight of the shackles you carried. The worse you were, the heavier they became, okay? The better behaved you were, the lighter they became. That's the way it worked. Sometimes you were double ironed. Now, double ironed means you're wearing 2 sets on each ankle, which means you have to carry 13.5 kilos on each ankle. So you can imagine what that does to each man's physique. So that's the work rate that the work that they came in to do. The punishment was very severe. Men were beaten with the cat o' nine tails, anywhere between 10 and 100 lashes at one time. So it was very, very harsh indeed. As I said, these men were professional criminals. They kept coming backwards and forwards, and you wonder why. They kept coming and getting the same treatment. Why? What's in the mind of a professional criminal, you do not know. But that was the reason. 73,000 convicts came to Van Diemen's Land, and of that number, 7,000 men and boys came through here. That's 10%, and combined they served 13,500 sentences. So the mathematicians amongst you will work out how many times these men are coming backwards and forwards. George Britton arrived here at the age of 14, died here at the age of 53, served 6 sentences whilst he was here. Bad, bad man. Never going to reform. Accumulated, you could only say, an impressive array of punishments. 18 months solitary confinement, 16 years the chain gang, 800 lashes with a cat o' nine tails. Those are the sorts of men who are here. Don't feel sorry for them. Okay. Let's come out here and we'll talk about the building, and we'll give you an idea of what it's all about.
Yeah.
Okay. This little island out here is called Ile de Mort, Isle of the Dead. Can you tell me what you think that is then, if it's the Isle of the Dead? It's a cemetery,
Yeah.
okay, where people are buried. Now, it was established in 1833 by the Reverend John Manton. We don't know how many convicts are buried out there. The reason being, the English had this bizarre wish to basically obliterate you from living memory when you died. So they're buried without a headstone or without a marker, so we truly don't know how many are out there. Okay, there was originally surveyed to take 2,400 graves. There's only 1,100 graves we know of, 900 plus convicts. It's probably a better accurate account, it's probably about 1,400 convicts. Very, very sad, because once you die, they forget you. I can tell you everything about a man's life here. If he comes through the front door, I can tell you what weight he was when he came in. I can tell you what weight he was when he went out. I can tell you every tattoo he had on his body. I will show you the drawings of the tattoos he had on his body. From the physical description, I can tell you exactly what he looked like. I can tell you his punishments, how he behaved himself, his work rate, his relationships, but I can tell you very little about his death. There'll be a bit about it, there'll be a date of death. There's possibly an entry that he's buried on the Isle of the Dead, but more importantly, it won't say where. And if the doctor knew what the cause of death was at the time, he'd write that down. But medicine not being what it is today, they'd just more or less, if they weren't too sure, they'd just write visitation from God. So a rather strange statement to make, but that's the way it was. Now, seeing I've got lots of boys here, I want you to listen very carefully. This bit of land out here is called Point Pua. Now, Pua is a Latin word. Pua means boy in Latin. This is the very first boys' prison ever established in the British Empire. Now, you may or may not know that in those days, the law did not discriminate between adults and children. As far as the law was concerned, you're an adult at the age of 7, and you could be tried at the age of 7 and condemned at the age of 7 as an adult. At the age of 8, you could be hung. At the age of 9, you could be transported to Australia. If you're a boy at the age of 9 and you committed a crime, you would come here to Point Pua. There was no such thing as juvenile justice in England in those days, like there is today. This was established in 1834. Now, this is the reason Port Arthur is a World Heritage Site, because this is the beginnings of Juvenile Justice Policy UK 2021. This is where it all started, the juvenile justice system in England, including the Borstal Reform School system. So the boys were separated from the men for purposes of not so much because the Commandant was concerned about their welfare and their moral welfare. He's more concerned that they'd learn more over here at the University of Crime, as he called it, from the old convicts like me, and basically become worse. So he separated them, which was good, separating the men from the boys. So he put the boys out there. Their average age was 13. Now they learned a trade, one of 20 trades. Now, you can become a bookbinder or a carpenter and joiner or any of those trades I mentioned before. You could also learn to read, write and do arithmetic, okay? And you could also learn a bit of religion and moral instruction. So when the boys started to come out of here, 85% success rate, they were certainly reformed, and more importantly, they were educated. Much better than they would have been if they're still running around the streets of English cities, okay? So that's what it was. So it wasn't terribly bad thing for them. In fact, it was such a great success that the English closed down this jail out here in 1849 and started to build proper jails for children in England from about 1852 onwards. The first one was at a place called Saltley near Birmingham. That's where it all began. Now, it wasn't a complete success though. There were always failures. And the biggest failure was 9. Who's 9? You're 9, but you're not a boy. All right, the youngest prisoner out here was 9 years of age. His name was James Lynch. And he was sent down from England for stealing 3 boxes of toys. Not because he wanted to play with them, he wanted to sell them. Now, James Lynch was already a criminal at the age of 9. That was his 19th court appearance once he's stealing the toys. Who's heard of Oliver Twist? Dickens. Yes, you have. Okay. This is a classic Dickens story. James Lynch was part of a London street gang. Okay, he had a Fagin. His Fagin was called James Walker. Now, this man had 20 kids in his employment. and they would steal the watches, they would steal the shirts, they would steal the lead and the money, and James Walker would sell them and give the boys a wage. It was typical Dickensian story. As a matter of fact, the character in Oliver Twist, Ike Solomon, the Fagin, Oliver Twist Fagin, was modelled on a man who was actually one of those men in prison here at Port Arthur, believe it or not. James Lynch was a complete failure. He never ever reformed. His last court appearance was here in Hobart at the age of 71. So he was a criminal from 9 to 71. So you can imagine what sort of man he was, a complete crook. So there we are. All right.
Wow.
Commandant's house in the corner, folks. That's where you need to go. That's the man in charge, the most senior military officer. Next door we have the military barracks, and where all the soldiers were housed, including the officers' quarters, which is that little cottage up there behind called Tower Cottage, and the men's barracks are on top of the hill here. Little cottage here called William Smith O'Brien's cottage. We had some political prisoners here, the Irish, the Americans, and some men from England called the Chartist Toll Puddle Martyrs, who were fighting for the rights of working men, and the English didn't like that, so they sent them down here out of the way. The men themselves lived over here in barracks where this house is now. They've long since gone, burnt down with fires and what have you, so that's where the men lived, in front of the industrial centre here. This is called the penitentiary. It became the penitentiary in 1857, but it was built in 1845 as a granary and a flour mill. And by 1853 it's redundant. In 1855 they decided to close down Norfolk Island, the other jail, and send all the criminals down here. No room in the barracks, so they turned this into the jail, and becomes a jail from 1857 onwards. 550 men accommodated in there. Okay, so that was the situation. So this was the biggest prison in the world. Here's the front gate. And the back gate is Eaglehawk Neck, where you came through across the dog line. That's the front, the back gate. This is the Tasman Peninsula. It's 660 square kilometres of countryside. So that is in fact the jail. All right, the biggest jail in the world. So there we are, give you an idea. Let's go over here, and I want to talk about this area up here briefly for you. In fact, we'll go to this little gate here.
How long is it? 14 minutes.
Trời ơi, kiến thức có gì đâu. Kiến thức nghe xong rồi quên mẹ.
Found the oak tree. Gotta find the oak tree. Huh? Find the oak tree and draw the leaves. Who finds the oak tree? I don't know.
Con coi trường hồi nãy bà la rồi.
No. What?
Yeah.
What do you mean?
Okay.
Huh?
Alright. I think this is the oak tree here. Reckon this is
This
the
one.
oak tree?
This one.
You have to draw the leaf.
They were treated pretty harshly though.
Yeah, but we can't feel back here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi.
Yeah.
So this area up here, folks, is a little English village. It's called Civil Road. This is where all the civilians live. We have the military at one end. Up that end, we've got the criminals in the middle, and the civilians live up here in this lovely village. So you need to go and have a look at that this afternoon. Up there you would find the magistrate, the medical staff, the clergy, and what was called the commissariat staff. The commissar was the man in charge of the production here, and they all lived up here in this lovely little English village, so along with the church. So you can have a look at those buildings. Those buildings were built for those people in the early to mid 1840s. So that's a lovely precinct, because that's where they lived as well. They also had the government gardens over here for their exclusive use for recreational purposes. Now, these people are upper class, so they're used to privilege and lifestyle. So basically, that's where they come all the way from England, 17,500 kilometres to the southerlymost jail in Australia. Can't come any further to work. 3,700 kilometres that way is the nearest bit of land. Can anybody guess what it is? Very cold place. Very good. Lots of ice and penguins down there. So it's regarded as not a hardship post, not popular. But just like in our careers today, you do the hard yards for the boss, you get promotion. So it was known as a career enhancing move. So the men would come down here and do the job, and most of them, particularly those in the military, if you did the half decent job, you got promoted. So it was tolerated. So they had a nice lifestyle though, and the beautiful gardens for them to live in. Over here where we're standing were their vegetable gardens and orchards. Now scurvy was a big problem when they first arrived because there wasn't enough fresh fruit and vegetables, and that was in 1830. By 1834 the vegetable gardens are producing all the fruit and vegetables sustained the whole population, including the criminals. In the mid 1840s they are producing upwards of 10,000 cabbages in this plot here, would you believe? So the men were well fed, and that's another thing. An interesting thing to note, that the men were well fed here, even though they're treated very harshly. They were well fed 3 good meals a day, high carbohydrate diet. Okay, so they weren't starved, but they were treated very harshly. All right, let's go over here for our last trip, folks. I want to talk about what happened when they'd stopped flogging. After a while flogging, they realised that beating a man doesn't work, so they introduced solitary confinement instead. So we'll take you over there, we'll have a talk about it, and then you can go and have a walk around, okay?
Let's go.
Nè, lá chụp cảnh cây lá vàng nhuộm đẹp nè.
Yeah, mud shots, you know, for gangsters taken in over a period of time. All right, folks, this building up here is called the Silent Prison. This is solitary confinement. Now, silent implies that you can't speak, and that's one of the rules. You're not allowed to talk. You've got to be quiet. Very quiet indeed. Because if you make any noise, you get punished further. So you go into this prison and you'll be locked in your cell for 23 hours a day. You're allowed out for 1 hour's exercise. That's all. And you stay in there for as long as necessary. And basically, that's how it all started. Now you work 6 days a week in your cell. You make brushes and brooms, or boots and shoes, or you sew uniforms, and you have 1 day off, and that's Sunday. And you are required then to read your Bible and talk to the clergyman. And the idea is to help you reform you. There are 145 rules to follow, and if you break any of them, you might go to the black hole. Because of COVID, we can't show you, but it's truly frightening. 4 doors close behind you. You get into a cell that's 6 by 8 feet, and it's completely black. And the idea is to disorientate you. You can go into that cell for 2 to 40 days on bread and water only, and then you go back to your other cell. And then that is added to your original sentence. So if you go in there for a year and you do 40 days in the black hole, you're in there for 1 year and 40 days. The problem is the men who they're putting in there kept accumulating sentences so they weren't getting out. It's very, very harsh. So when you go and see it, you'll see how frightening it was for the men. It was so frightening, in fact, you can imagine what sort of medical issues the men suffered from. If you do that to a man, what happens to you if you lock him up, isolated?
Yeah.
Starts to go mad. Exactly right. And there was a big rise of psychological trauma, insanity, or lunacy as they called it in those days. And it got so bad in 1861 they had to build a special institution to deal with it, and that's the asylum next door. So this is the new regime, and it's very, very harsh indeed, and it's no better than beating the men. So that's a sad fact, really. But now we're talking about the 1860s, and Port Arthur's almost run its course. It's just about finished its life. It's basically redundant because lots of things have happened in Tasmania. Tasmania, like New South Wales, has become its own colonial state. It's got its own government. It's still tied to the English crown, but it's an independent state. So what the government does, it stops transportation of convicts. We don't need any more convicts. There's enough free people coming, and the economy is running very, very nicely. Thank you. We don't need these criminals. So basically this place is redundant. So if we come to the time when the last commandant arrived here in April 1874, his name was John Coverdale, and his wife Anne. He moved into the house up on top of the hill. The commandant's house. There's only 250 men left. And it's no longer an industrial site, it's a hospital for broken down, defeated old convicts, insane or ill or whatever. So they're just working out their time. Now John Coverdale's job, two things he has to do: close Port Arthur down and move all the men out of this system into the civil system. And he's appointed because he's a GP, a doctor from Hobart, okay? And being a doctor, he can do a medical assessment on all the men and move them out to the proper institutions rather than this place. It takes him 2.5 years to do that. And on the 17th of September 1877, almost literally 47 years later to the day, he takes the last 7 men out of here and takes them down to a ship called the Harriet in the harbour. They take them up to the Campbell Street jail in Hobart and lock them up, and everybody just gets up and walks away. And that's the end of Port Arthur. It finishes. Just sits here. And for the next few years it falls into rack and ruin. Now, it gets burnt down 3 times by bushfires, 1880, 1895 and 1897, so most of it is burnt to the ground. That's why all the buildings are missing. In 1880 the government decides to have an auction. They want to try and get some return on their investment. So they have an auction, they sell everything off to private interests and people move in, and they turn this into a little village called Carnarvon. Numbers of people buy these buildings and they start to take them apart. So for the next 50 years Port Arthur's a builder's wrecker's yard. So it just falls into rack and ruin. By the 1950s, convict tourism generally is becoming very, very lucrative, and certainly lots of Australians and visitors are interested in our convict history, so the government decides, well, we better do something about protecting Port Arthur. So they take back ownership. They change the name back to Port Arthur. So the rest is history, so to speak. So this is where we are today. So all the money that you good folks spend, we put straight back into this place, okay? And give you an idea of our convict history. But mindful of the fact this is the worst of the worst places. I have to remind you that most convicts who came to Australia were not real criminals. Their crimes are crimes of survival. Like they're trying to survive in England, so you can't get a job, you can't get any food for your kids. What do? You steal. That doesn't necessarily make you a criminal. You only do it out of necessity. So most convicts were only one-time service. This prison here is for the professionals. So there we are. So there you go, folks. A brief history for it. Have a look. And,
Yep.
have a wander around. Now, I know some folks from Sydney here, but you might be interested. There's a great photographic exhibition up here of 20th century gangsters and crooks. If you want to go and have a look at it, it's fantastic. So do that as well. So thanks for listening and enjoy your day.
Thank you.
No worries. Okay.